The wind doesn't move the way it should across the flatlands of western Kansas. It doesn't whisper. It keens. There are places in America where the earth remembers what was done to it, where the soil holds secrets that rot from the inside out, where families built their homesteads not on hope, but on something older, something that required payment. In the winter of 1898, a traveling missionary named Reverend Caleb Moss arrived in a settlement so small it had no name on any map. He came seeking converts. What he found instead would haunt him until his death 40 years later in an asylum outside Topeka. His journal, discovered in 1963 among water-damaged church records, describes a place where children didn't play, where livestock refused to graze, and where every house bore the same mark carved into its doorframe. A circle, a line, and something that might have been a handprint, or might have been something trying to become one. Welcome to this channel. Today, we step into a case that is not just difficult to understand, it reshapes the meaning of fear itself. Like the video, subscribe to this channel and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? The Whitmere clan first appeared in Kansas territorial records in 1874, shortly after the Homestead Act opened the western prairies to settlement. They came not as individuals but as a unit, 37 people traveling in covered wagons from somewhere in the Appalachian Highlands, though no one could ever pinpoint exactly where. The county clerk in Dodge City noted in his ledger that the family spokesman, a man named Josiah Whitmere, spoke English with an accent that seemed to shift between Scots-Irish and something else entirely, something the clerk described as having too many consonants in places where vowels should be. Josiah claimed they were God-fearing folk seeking farmland. He paid in silver coins, so old the dates had worn away. The clerk accepted the money, but later told his wife that something about those coins made his hands itch for 3 days afterward. The Whitmeres settled 70 miles northwest of Dodge City, in a region where the grasslands began to give way to harder, more unforgiving terrain. They built their homes in a cluster rather than spread across separate claims, which struck neighboring homesteaders as peculiar. Most families wanted distance from one another, wanted privacy, wanted their own piece of the American promise. The Whitmeres wanted proximity. They wanted to see each other's fires at night. By 1880, there were already whispers. A rancher named Thomas Bellamy, whose property bordered Whitmere land, reported to the county sheriff that he'd lost 17 head of cattle in a single month. Not to disease, not to rustlers. The cattle simply walked onto Whitmere property and didn't walk back. Bellamy went looking for them once and found their remains arranged in a dry creek bed, their bones picked clean but laid out in a pattern that made him physically ill to look at. He couldn't describe the pattern except to say it was deliberate and that it reminded him of letters in a language he didn't know. When the sheriff visited the Whitmere settlement to investigate, Josiah met him at the boundary of their land. The sheriff later wrote in his report that Josiah was pleasant, cooperative, and insisted the cattle must have died of natural causes. But what stuck with the sheriff was Josiah's smile. He said it was the kind of smile that didn't reach the eyes, didn't even seem to reach the mouth really, just sat on his face like something he'd learned to do rather than something he felt. The first mention of ritual behavior comes from a schoolteacher named Margaret Dunn, who arrived in the region in 1883 to establish a one-room schoolhouse for the scattered farming families. She noted in letters to her sister in Illinois that none of the Whitmere children attended school for the first 3 months. When she rode out to their settlement to inquire, she was met by Josiah's wife, a woman named Constance who appeared to be no more than 30 but moved like someone far older. Constance explained that their children were educated at home, that they followed a different calendar, that their religion required certain observances that wouldn't align with the school year. Margaret asked what religion. Constance said it was very old. When Margaret pressed, asking if they were Catholic or some particular Protestant sect, Constance simply repeated that it was very old and invited her inside for tea. Margaret accepted. She stayed for 20 minutes. In her letter, she wrote that the interior of the Whitmere home was spotlessly clean but wrong in ways she struggled to articulate. The furniture was handmade, sturdy, but proportioned strangely, as if built for people who were almost but not quite the right size. The walls were bare except for a single frame that held not a picture, but a piece of cloth embroidered with symbols Margaret recognized from her classical education as being vaguely Greek, vaguely Celtic, but mostly nothing she'd ever seen. And the children. She counted 6 children in that house, ages ranging from perhaps 4 to 14, and not one of them spoke. Not one of them made a sound. They watched her with identical expressions of mild curiosity, and when she left, she realized she couldn't remember any of their faces clearly, only that they'd been watching her the entire time. By 1885, the Whitmere settlement had grown. More families with the Whitmere name arrived from back east, always claiming to be cousins or distant relations. The population swelled to nearly 80 people, all living in that tight cluster of homes. They contributed to the local economy, purchasing supplies from the general store in the nearest town, a place called Ashford Station that consisted of perhaps 24 buildings. They paid in cash. They were polite. They never caused trouble. But the trouble seemed to find its way to them. Or rather, trouble seemed to happen around them in ways that were never quite their fault. A farmhand named Peter Kovacs went missing after taking a shortcut across Whitmere land on his way home from a neighboring ranch. His body was found 3 weeks later in a ravine 2 miles from any Whitmere property. The cause of death was listed as exposure, but the town doctor privately told the local minister that he'd never seen exposure do that to a man's face, make it look like he died trying to scream but couldn't get his mouth to work right. If you're still listening, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to this channel, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? The winter of 1889 brought the first documented account of what would later be called the Whitmere gatherings. A trapper named Samuel Holt was working his lines in the hills north of the settlement when he saw lights moving through the darkness. This was unusual because it was past midnight on a Tuesday in January, temperature well below freezing, not a night for anyone to be out unless absolutely necessary. Samuel's curiosity got the better of him. He followed the lights and found himself overlooking a clearing where the Whitmeres had gathered, all of them, every man, woman, and child from the settlement, standing in concentric circles around something Samuel couldn't quite see from his vantage point. They were singing. That's what Samuel called it in his later testimony to the county marshal. Singing. But he also said it wasn't like any hymn or folk song he'd ever heard. The melody went in directions that didn't make sense, notes that seemed to hang in the air longer than sound should, words in a language that made his teeth ache. At the center of the circles was a fire, and in the fire was something burning that produced smoke so black it seemed to absorb the moonlight. Samuel watched for perhaps 10 minutes before his instinct for self-preservation overwhelmed his curiosity. He backed away slowly, quietly, and didn't stop moving until he was 5 miles distant. He told 3 people what he'd seen: his brother, the county marshal, and the minister of Ashford Station. His brother dismissed it as frontier superstition. The marshal said there was no law against people gathering on their own property. The minister made a note in his personal journal that he should visit the Whitmeres and inquire about their spiritual welfare. He never made that visit. 3 months later, Samuel Holt left Kansas and returned to his family in Pennsylvania. Before he left, he told the general store owner that there were some things a man wasn't meant to see and that he'd seen enough. The pattern continued through the next decade. Strange lights, livestock disappearing, occasional reports of sounds coming from the Whitmere settlement late at night. Sounds described variously as chanting, as wailing, as something between human speech and animal distress, but nothing that could be called a crime, nothing that gave law enforcement grounds to intervene. The Whitmeres paid their taxes. They caused no disputes. They existed on the edge of the community, tolerated but not welcomed, present but not integrated. And the children kept coming. Census records from this period show that the Whitmere population maintained a steady growth rate despite there being no record of births or arrivals. In 1890, the census counted 83 Whitmeres. In 1895-97, Where were the additional people coming from? No one asked. At least, no one asked officially. Then came the winter of 1897, and with it, the Larson family. Swedish immigrants, newly arrived in Kansas, who purchased a property that happened to share a border with Whitmere land. Eric and Ingrid Larson had 4 children and plans to build a prosperous farm. They were hardworking, devout Lutherans who believed in community and good neighborliness. Ingrid baked bread and took a loaf to the Whitmeres as a welcoming gesture. She returned home 3 hours later, and according to her husband's later testimony, she was changed. Not physically. She looked the same, but she wouldn't speak about what she'd seen inside the Whitmere homes. She wouldn't eat the bread she'd baked. She spent that night on her knees in prayer, and when Eric tried to comfort her, she told him they needed to leave, needed to abandon the property and go back east, go anywhere but here. Eric, practical and stubborn, refused. They'd invested everything in this land. They weren't going to be frightened away by peculiar neighbors. 3 weeks later, their youngest child, a boy of 5 named Anders, vanished from the yard where he'd been playing. The search party found him 2 days later, alive and unharmed, sitting in a field half a mile from the Whitmere settlement. He couldn't or wouldn't explain where he'd been. He spoke only in whispers for the next 6 months, and when he finally regained his voice, he had developed a stutter that would plague him for the rest of his life. But worse than the stutter were the nightmares. Anders would wake screaming about the singing people, about the room beneath the ground, about the thing they kept in the box that wasn't a box. Child psychologists didn't exist in rural Kansas in the late 19th century. The Larsons did what they could, which was to pray and hope time would heal whatever had broken in their son. It was Reverend Caleb Moss who finally brought outside attention to the Whitmere settlement. He arrived in Ashford Station in January of 1898 as part of a missionary circuit through the Western Territories. He was young, zealous, convinced that every soul could be saved through proper ministry. When the local storekeeper mentioned the Whitmeres, mentioned that they kept to themselves and didn't attend any church, Reverend Moss saw an opportunity. He rode out to their settlement on a bright cold morning, his Bible in his saddlebag, his faith unshakable. He returned to town 4 hours later. The storekeeper who saw him said the Reverend's hands were shaking so badly he couldn't hold the reins properly. His horse had to find its own way back. Reverend Moss went directly to the boarding house where he was staying, locked himself in his room, and didn't emerge for 3 days. When he finally came out, he told the boarding house owner that he would be cutting his missionary visit short, that he needed to return to Topeka immediately, that there were authorities who needed to be informed about what was happening in this place. He never made it to Topeka. Not then. He made it as far as the train station in Dodge City before he collapsed. The doctor who examined him found nothing physically wrong except exhaustion and what would now be recognized as acute psychological trauma. Reverend Moss was sedated and kept under observation for a week. During that week, he spoke in fragments about what he'd witnessed in the Whitmere settlement, about the children who moved wrong, about the basement that seemed to extend far deeper than any basement should, about the woman who'd shown him the book, the old book, the book that predated the Bible by centuries, and told a different story about what humanity owed to the things that came before. If you're still listening, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to this channel, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? The journal that Reverend Moss kept provides the most detailed first-hand account of the Whitmere settlement's interior life. The journal itself is difficult to read, not because of the handwriting, which remains clear and precise throughout, but because of what it describes. Moss writes that he was initially greeted warmly by Josiah Whitmere, who by then would have been in his 60s but appeared vigorous and alert. Josiah invited him inside the largest of the settlement buildings, a structure that served as a combination meeting house and residence for the extended family. The interior was lit by oil lamps, clean but spare. Moss noted that there were no crosses, no religious iconography of any kind, which he found unusual for a frontier settlement where faith was often the only comfort against the harshness of the land. When Moss inquired about their spiritual practices, Josiah was forthcoming. He explained that their faith was ancestral, passed down through generations, originating in the Old Country. When Moss asked which Old Country, Josiah smiled and said the very Old Country, the one that existed before borders, before nations, before the names of God became standardized. Moss, trained in theology, recognized this as heresy but was curious enough to continue the conversation. Josiah spoke of obligations, of debts owed by humanity to forces that had been patient, that had waited through the rise and fall of civilizations, that would continue waiting until the time came for collection. Moss asked what was owed. Josiah said attention, acknowledgement, and occasionally renewal. The word renewal appears 17 times in Moss's journal, always capitalized, always without clear explanation. Context suggests it referred to some kind of ritual observance, but the specifics remained opaque. Moss writes that he asked to observe a service to understand their worship. Josiah considered the request and agreed, with the stipulation that Moss would not interfere, would not speak, would simply witness. Moss agreed. This was his mistake, though he wouldn't recognize it as such until later. The service took place that evening. Moss describes being led to a building he hadn't initially noticed, set slightly apart from the others, partially below ground level. The entrance required descending a series of stone steps that Moss noted were worn smooth, suggesting centuries of use rather than decades. Inside, the space opened into a chamber larger than should have been possible given the building's exterior dimensions. Moss, despite his growing unease, documented the details with scholarly precision. The walls were earth, shored up with timber, but the timber was carved with symbols that reminded him of his seminary studies of ancient Near Eastern religions, of pre-Christian European paganism, of things he'd encountered only in academic texts about primitive belief systems. The Whitmeres filed in silently, taking positions that seemed predetermined. The children stood in the innermost ring. The adults formed two outer rings. At the northern end of the chamber, on a raised platform, stood a structure Moss initially thought was an altar but later crossed out that word in his journal and replaced it with doorway, though he adds in the margin that this isn't quite right either. The ceremony began with silence, complete silence. Moss writes that he became aware of his own heartbeat, his own breathing, aware of them in a way that felt invasive, as if the silence was pressing in on him from all sides. Then the children began, not singing. Moss is specific about this. They made sounds that formed patterns, tones that resonated in ways that affected him physically. He describes a pressure behind his eyes, a sensation in his chest like something was trying to synchronize with his heartbeat. The adults joined, their voices lower, creating harmonics that Moss says should not have been possible with human vocal cords. And then the thing on the platform began to change. Moss's description here becomes fragmented. He writes of light that wasn't light, of the air becoming thick, of seeing movement in his peripheral vision that vanished when he tried to look directly at it. He writes that the children stepped forward, that each one placed their hands on the platform, that he could see their lips moving but couldn't hear words, only felt the words, felt them in his bones. The ceremony lasted perhaps 20 minutes. When it ended, the Whitmeres filed out with the same silence they'd entered with. Moss remained, unable to move for several minutes. When he finally stood, he writes that he looked at the platform and saw that the symbols carved into it were glowing faintly, a phosphorescence that faded even as he watched. And he saw something else. Scratches in the earth around the platform, not random, deliberate, counting marks, hundreds of them, thousands, as if someone or something had been keeping track of time in a place where no other record existed. Moss left the Whitmere settlement immediately after the ceremony. Josiah made no attempt to stop him, simply thanked him for witnessing and said that now Moss understood why they preferred to keep their own counsel. On the ride back to Ashford Station, Moss writes that he became convinced he was being followed, though when he turned to look, there was nothing but empty prairie behind him. He writes of a smell that clung to his clothes, something like copper and old earth, and something sweet underneath that made him nauseous. He writes that when he closed his eyes, He could still see the patterns the children had formed, could still feel the resonance of their voices in his chest. And he writes, in a passage that's been underlined so heavily the pen nearly tore through the paper, that he understood why the settlement had no graveyard. There was no graveyard because there were no bodies to bury. Whatever happened to the Whitmeres when they died, it didn't involve burial in consecrated ground. The authorities Moss hoped to contact proved frustratingly uninterested. The county sheriff listened to his account and noted that strange religious practices weren't illegal as long as no one was being harmed. Moss insisted that harm was being done, that children were being subjected to psychological abuse at minimum, that there were indications of something far worse. But he had no bodies, no physical evidence, no testimony from anyone within the settlement claiming mistreatment. His own journal was too fragmented, too influenced by what officials clearly believed was religious hysteria, to constitute actionable evidence. Moss spent the next 2 years writing letters to church authorities, to territorial officials, to anyone who might listen. Most of his letters went unanswered. Those that received responses were polite but dismissive. The general consensus was that Reverend Moss had been affected by the isolation and hardship of frontier ministry, that he needed rest and perhaps reassignment to a more settled community. In 1900, Moss returned to the Ashford Station area. He didn't announce his presence. He didn't contact local authorities. He simply watched the Whitmere settlement from a distance, documenting their movements, their patterns, waiting for evidence that would convince skeptics. His journal from this period becomes increasingly paranoid. He writes of being watched in return, of finding symbols carved into trees along the routes he traveled, of dreams where the children spoke to him in that language of tones and patterns, explaining things he didn't want to understand. If you're still listening, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to this channel, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? The break in the case came not from Moss but from inside the settlement itself. In March of 1901, a young woman named Sarah Whitmere appeared at the sheriff's office in Ashford Station. She was 17 years old, thin to the point of emaciation, and terrified. She claimed to have escaped from the settlement the previous night. Her testimony, recorded by Sheriff Donald Crawford, provides the only first-hand account from someone raised within the Whitmere community. Sarah described a life that was simultaneously mundane and nightmarish. The Whitmeres lived simply, worked their land, maintained their homes, but everything, she said, was oriented around preparation for what they called the renewal cycle. From earliest childhood, Whitmere children were taught that they were part of an obligation that stretched back through generations, that their family had made an agreement in the old country, the very old country, and that breaking this agreement would result in consequences not just for them but for everyone. The nature of the agreement was kept deliberately vague until children reached age 12, at which point they underwent what Sarah called the first teaching. This involved spending 3 days and nights in the underground chamber, alone except for the presence of what she described as the attendant. When Sheriff Crawford asked what the attendant was, Sarah became agitated. She said it wasn't a person, but it wasn't not a person either. It was what came when they called. It was what had always come when they called, going back to the beginning, going back to before her family had names they could speak aloud. Sarah's testimony continued for 3 hours. She described rituals conducted on specific lunar cycles, always involving the children, always involving the descent into the underground chamber. She described a book kept by the family elders, written in a mixture of languages, some recognizable, some not, that contained instructions for maintaining the agreement. She described the counting marks Moss had seen, explaining that each mark represented a cycle completed, a debt paid, a term of the agreement honored. When Crawford asked how many marks there were, Sarah said she'd tried to count them once and had reached 5,000 before being discovered and punished. When Crawford asked what form the punishment took, Sarah pulled back her sleeves and showed scars on her forearms. Not cuts, burns, circular burns that formed a pattern. Crawford's report notes that the pattern matched symbols he'd seen in books about occult practices, though he admitted he had no expertise in such matters. The most disturbing element of Sarah's testimony concerned what happened to those who completed the full cycle of obligations. She said that when a Whitmere reached their 50th year, they underwent a final teaching. After this teaching, they changed. They stopped aging in any visible way. They became what she called hollow, present but distant, moving through life as if watching it from somewhere else. And they stopped bleeding. Sarah said she'd seen her grandfather cut himself deeply while working in the fields, watched him wrap the wound, and 2 days later there was no scar, no mark, nothing to indicate he'd ever been injured. She said she'd asked him about it, and he'd looked at her with eyes that held no recognition, no familial warmth, and told her that after the final teaching, the body belonged to the agreement, and the agreement knew how to maintain what it owned. Sheriff Crawford found himself in an impossible position. Sarah's testimony was detailed and consistent, but it described practices that, while deeply disturbing, weren't clearly illegal. There was no evidence of physical abuse that rose to the level of criminal assault. There was no evidence of kidnapping or unlawful imprisonment beyond Sarah's own escape, which implied the ability to leave. Crawford consulted with the county prosecutor, who advised that any action against the Whitmere settlement would require substantial physical evidence or corroborating testimony from multiple sources. Sarah was the only source, and her testimony, influenced by what prosecutors believed was religious indoctrination and possible mental instability, wouldn't be sufficient to secure warrants or convictions. Crawford did the only thing he could do within the bounds of his authority. He visited the Whitmere settlement with Sarah's testimony in hand and informed Josiah Whitmere that allegations had been made, that while no charges were being filed, the settlement would be under observation, and that any evidence of harm to children would be prosecuted to the full extent of the law. Josiah listened calmly, expressed regret that Sarah had felt compelled to leave, and assured the sheriff that all members of the community were free to depart at any time, though most chose to stay because they understood the importance of their heritage. Crawford left with the distinct impression that his visit had changed nothing, that Josiah had been completely unbothered by the intrusion of outside authority. Sarah Whitmere never returned to the settlement. She found work as a housemaid in Dodge City, changed her surname to Whitman, and lived quietly for the next 4 years. In 1905, she married a railroad clerk named Thomas Gardner and moved with him to Colorado, before she left Kansas. She gave a final interview to a journalist from the Dodge City newspaper who'd heard about her testimony and smelled a sensational story. The interview was never published. The journalist, a man named Henry Blackwell, told his editor that after speaking with Sarah for 2 hours, he decided the story was either the ravings of a damaged mind or something so disturbing that printing it would constitute irresponsible journalism. His notes from the interview survive in the newspaper's archives. In them, Sarah describes the underground chamber in greater detail. She says the chamber connected to a series of tunnels that extended far beyond the Whitmere property, tunnels that the elders said had been there when they arrived, tunnels that followed patterns in the earth that predated human settlement. She says she'd been in the tunnels once, during her first teaching, and that the tunnels were marked with the same symbols that covered the platform in the ceremony chamber. And she says that deep in the tunnels, in a space the elders called the root, there was something alive. Not alive the way animals or people are alive. Alive the way the earth is alive, present and aware but operating on a scale of time that made human lifespans irrelevant. She says the agreement her family maintained was with this thing, this presence, and that the rituals were a way of keeping it content, keeping it patient, keeping it from expressing its attention in ways that would draw notice from the outside world. By 1906, the Whitmere settlement had become a footnote in local history, one of those peculiar communities that existed on the margins of normal society but caused no significant problems. Reverend Moss had been committed to an asylum in 1904 after attempting to burn down what he claimed was a Whitmere-affiliated meeting house in Topeka. Sarah Whitmere had disappeared into the broader fabric of American life. The settlement continued, insular and unchanged, through the first decade of the 20th century. Then came the drought of 1910. The entire Central Plains region suffered, but the area around the Whitmere settlement was hit particularly hard. Crops failed. Wells ran dry. Families began abandoning their homesteads, moving east or west, seeking regions where the land would still support life. The Whitmeres stayed, and more than that, their land stayed green. Neighboring ranchers reported seeing irrigation systems that shouldn't have been possible given the water table depth. Some reported that the Whitmere fields seemed to draw moisture from the air itself, that morning dew on their crops was so heavy it looked like rain had fallen overnight, even though the sky had been cloudless for weeks. Resentment built. During times of hardship, people look for scapegoats, look for explanations that make sense of their suffering. The Whitmere prosperity during universal hardship made them targets. If you're still listening, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to this channel, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? In July of 1911, a group of 7 men from Ashford Station rode out to the Whitmere settlement. They were armed. They were angry. They demanded to know how the Whitmeres were maintaining their crops, accused them of stealing water, threatened violence if answers weren't provided. What happened next is disputed. The men who rode out returned 3 hours later, subdued and shaken. They refused to discuss what had transpired except to say that no violence had occurred, that they'd been wrong to threaten the Whitmeres, and that the matter was resolved. But one of the men, a rancher named Bill Sykes, told his wife that night that he'd seen something in the Whitmere settlement that changed his understanding of the world. He wouldn't elaborate. His wife pressed. He broke down and said that the Whitmeres had taken them to the edge of their property and shown them the source of their water. It wasn't a well. It wasn't a spring. It was an opening in the ground, not large, perhaps 3 feet across, from which cold air and moisture flowed continuously. And in the darkness of that opening, something had moved. Something had noticed them. And Josiah Whitmere had explained, very calmly, that the land provided for those who maintained the old agreements, and that outsiders should be grateful the agreements were being maintained, because the alternative was worse than drought, worse than crop failure, worse than anything Sykes could imagine. Bill Sykes sold his ranch 2 months later and moved back east. He never spoke about the Whitmeres again. The settlement's population began to decline in the 1920s. Census records show the steady drop from 97 individuals in 1895 to 73 in 1920 to 41 in 1930. But there's a peculiarity in these numbers. The decline wasn't due to deaths. No Whitmere deaths were recorded in county records during this entire period. The decline was attributed to emigration, to family members leaving for opportunities elsewhere. But there were no records of where they went, no forwarding addresses, no correspondence. They simply disappeared from the census rolls. A postal inspector who reviewed mail delivery records for the settlement in 1928 noted that the Whitmeres received almost no personal mail, no letters from distant relatives, no communications that would indicate family members had dispersed to other locations. It was as if those who left the settlement ceased to exist in any documentable way. The inspector found this curious but not actionable. People had a right to privacy, a right to sever ties if they chose. The final documented interaction between the Whitmere settlement and outside authority came in 1933. The Great Depression had devastated rural Kansas. The Dust Bowl was beginning. Federal agencies were conducting surveys of agricultural communities, assessing damage, distributing relief where possible. A Department of Agriculture inspector named Robert Chase was assigned to survey the area, including the Whitmere settlement. His report, filed in November of 1933, is the last official document that mentions the Whitmeres. Chase describes a community in decline but not in crisis. The buildings were maintained. The fields, such as they were, showed signs of cultivation, but the people, Chase writes, were strange, not hostile, not welcoming either, simply present. He counted 32 individuals, mostly adults, a handful of children. When he asked about crop yields, soil conditions, need for federal assistance, he received answers that were technically responsive but empty of real content. The Whitmeres said they were managing. They declined relief. They asked to be left alone. Chase complied. His final note in the report states that he had no official reason to return to the settlement, that they appeared self-sufficient, and that, frankly, there was something about the place that made him uncomfortable in ways he couldn't articulate professionally. After 1933, the Whitmeres disappear from official records entirely. County tax records show the property was maintained, taxes paid, but no specific names attached to the payments. The 1940 census lists the area but notes no residents at the Whitmere location. By 1950, local memory of the settlement had faded. The buildings remained, visible from the main road, but no one saw smoke from chimneys, no lights at night, no signs of habitation. Eventually, the land was declared abandoned and reverted to county ownership. In 1968, a developer purchased the property with plans to subdivide it for residential use. His survey crew spent 3 days on the land before refusing to continue. They reported structural instabilities, strange acoustic phenomena, and a pervasive sense of unease. The developer abandoned the project. The land was resold several times over the next 3 decades, each owner attempting some form of development, each abandoning the effort within months. The buildings collapsed gradually through neglect and weather. By 2000, nothing remained but foundations and the memory of foundations. But memories persist in other ways. In 1997, a team of anthropologists from the University of Kansas conducted oral history interviews with elderly residents of communities around the former Whitmere settlement. They found a surprising consistency in the stories. Everyone remembered the Whitmeres. Everyone agreed they were strange. And everyone, when pressed, described experiences that didn't quite fit rational explanation. Lights where lights shouldn't be. Sounds that carried too far across empty land. The sense that something was watching from the darkness beyond the firelight. One interviewee, a woman in her 80s named Dorothy Mills, remembered her grandmother telling her to never go near Whitmere land, that the earth there was wrong, that it had been fed things that changed it. When the anthropologist asked what had been fed to the land, Dorothy said her grandmother wouldn't elaborate, would only say that some debts get paid in ways decent people don't discuss. If you're still listening, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to this channel, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? The academic study of the Whitmere case raises more questions than it answers. Anthropologists recognize elements of their practices from various religious traditions. The emphasis on cyclical renewal appears in agricultural societies worldwide. The concept of ancestral obligations is common in many cultures. The use of ritual to maintain cosmic balance is nearly universal in pre-modern belief systems. But the specific combination of elements in Whitmere practice doesn't match any known tradition. It's as if they were following a template that predated or existed parallel to recognized religious developments. Some researchers have suggested the Whitmeres were practitioners of a syncretic faith, combining European folk magic with Native American spiritual practices with their own innovations. But this theory doesn't account for the consistency of their practices over more than half a century, the specific nature of their symbols, or the testimonies of people like Sarah Whitmere and Reverend Moss, which describe something more systematic, more ancient, more intentional than ad hoc syncretism. The underground chamber has become a particular focus of speculation. Multiple witnesses described its existence, described its dimensions as being larger than surface structures would suggest, described symbols and markings consistent with great age. In 2003, a team using ground-penetrating radar surveyed the former Whitmere property. They found anomalies. The radar indicated void spaces beneath the surface, spaces that formed patterns rather than random cavities. One researcher described the pattern as resembling a root system, spreading out from a central point, extending for nearly a mile in all directions. But when the team sought permission to excavate to verify what the radar had detected, they were denied. The land was privately owned by that point, and the owner, citing liability concerns, refused access. The owner, a Kansas City attorney who'd purchased the property as an investment, mentioned in a later interview that he'd visited the site once, had walked the boundaries, and had decided that whatever potential profit might come from development wasn't worth the feeling the place gave him. He said the silence was wrong. Not peaceful silence, empty silence. The kind of silence that makes you aware something is listening. The question that haunts researchers is simple and unanswerable. What happened to the Whitmeres? The census shows they were there in 1930. They were gone by 1940. 32 people, according to Robert Chase's count, don't simply vanish without trace. But they did. No death certificates, no immigration records, no property sales or transfers that would indicate relocation. They existed in a specific place for more than 60 years and then stopped existing in any verifiable way. The conventional explanation is that they dispersed, that the community finally broke apart under the pressures of modernization and economic hardship, that members left individually or in small groups for destinations unknown, and that the lack of records simply reflects the chaos of the Depression era. But this explanation requires accepting that an insular community that had maintained rigid cohesion for generations suddenly fragmented completely, and that none of the 32 individuals left any trace in the historical record thereafter. It requires accepting that their obsessive documentation of their own rituals, their careful maintenance of agreements and obligations, somehow didn't extend to any normal record-keeping about births, deaths, or movements. It requires accepting an absence of evidence as evidence of normal behavior, when everything about the Whitmeres was abnormal. The alternative explanation is the one no academic paper will seriously consider, but that surfaces repeatedly in informal discussions, in late-night conversations among researchers who have spent too long studying the case. The alternative is that the Whitmeres completed something, that the cycles they maintained, the renewals they performed, the obligations they honored, all led to an endpoint, and that the endpoint involved a transformation or a transition or a payment of the final debt. Sarah Whitmere told Sheriff Crawford that after the final teaching, people became hollow, that the agreement owned them. What if the agreement eventually consumed them entirely? What if the counting marks in the underground chamber were tracking not just cycles completed but progressed toward a conclusion? 5,000 marks when Sarah tried to count them in 1900. How many more by 1933? And what happened when the count was complete? Reverend Moss, in his final lucid writings before his permanent institutionalization, theorized that the Whitmeres weren't worshiping something. They were feeding it, not with sacrifices in any conventional sense, but with attention, with acknowledgement, with the organized focus of human consciousness directed at something that existed in the spaces between human perception. He wrote that consciousness was food for beings that operated outside normal physical laws, and that the Whitmeres had been cultivating a specific form of consciousness through their rituals, generation after generation, refining it, concentrating it, until they'd created something that could sustain their bargain indefinitely. But even Moss admitted this was speculation, born from his inability to reconcile what he'd witnessed with his theological training. His last journal entry, written in 1937, asks a single question. If the Whitmeres were the ones maintaining the agreement, keeping the thing and the root satisfied and patient, what happens now that they're gone? The land where the Whitmere settlement stood remains undeveloped. The current owner, the third since the Kansas City attorney, is a limited liability corporation based in Delaware that purchased the property in 2015. They've done nothing with it. Property tax records show the taxes are paid promptly each year from an account that appears to have no other activity. Multiple attempts by local historians and journalists to contact the ownership entity have gone unanswered. The land sits empty, legally owned but functionally abandoned as it has been for more than 70 years. People drive past it on the county road that runs along its southern border. Some notice it, most don't. It's just empty prairie, no different from 1,000 other empty sections in western Kansas, except for the silence. People who stop near the property, who get out of their cars to stretch or look at the sunset, notice the silence. It's profound and unsettling. No bird calls. No insect sounds. Even the wind seems muted. And those who have stopped report feeling watched, feeling that their presence is noted and assessed. Most get back in their cars quickly. A few have reported something else, something they struggle to describe. A sense of rhythm beneath their feet, slow and deep, like a heartbeat from the earth itself. In 2019, a podcast team investigating historical oddities in the American Midwest spent a night camping on the edge of the former Whitmere property. They brought recording equipment, hoping to capture something interesting for their show. What they captured was hours of silence interrupted by sounds their equipment registered, but that don't correspond to any known natural or mechanical sources. One sound, occurring at irregular intervals, was analyzed by an audio engineer who described it as similar to human vocalization, but at frequencies too low for normal human speech. Another sound resembled rhythmic tapping, hundreds of impacts in coordinated patterns, coming from beneath the ground. The podcast team left before dawn. Their episode about the experience was one of their most downloaded, but they never returned to the location and declined multiple requests for follow-up investigations. One team member, in a later interview, said that spending that night on the property convinced him that some places should be left alone, that whatever questions the Whitmere land might answer, the answers wouldn't be worth the asking. The case remains open in the sense that no definitive explanation exists. The Whitmeres came to Kansas in 1874. They maintained practices that combined religious devotion with something older and stranger. They persisted through decades, through hardship, through outside scrutiny, until they simply weren't there anymore. The buildings they left behind have collapsed. The fields they cultivated have returned to wild grass. The chamber beneath the ground, if it exists, remains sealed and hidden. But the patterns persist. Local emergency services report an unusual number of missing persons cases in the broader region around the former settlement. Not enough to trigger major investigations, but enough to be statistically notable. Hikers and hunters sometimes report disorientation in areas near the property, compasses malfunctioning, GPS devices showing impossible readings, time seeming to dilate in ways that leave them confused about how long they've been walking. And on certain nights, particularly during the dark of the moon, people driving the county road report seeing lights moving across the empty land, lights that don't behave like vehicles or fires, lights that seem to be following patterns, tracing symbols on the darkness. The Whitmere case challenges our understanding of how communities function, how belief systems operate, and what might exist in the margins of documented history. It presents a narrative that's simultaneously mundane and impossible, rooted in verifiable facts but extending into territory that defies rational analysis. The Whitmeres were real. The settlement existed. People witnessed their practices and documented their presence. But what those practices were in service of, what the settlement's true purpose was, remains elusive. Were they protecting something? Were they maintaining something? Were they themselves part of something larger, a system of obligations that stretched across continents and centuries, manifesting in isolated communities that kept old agreements alive while the modern world grew up around them, oblivious? The final piece of the Whitmere story comes from an unexpected source. In 2023, a woman in Colorado contacted the Kansas Historical Society. Her name was Jennifer Gardner. She explained that she was going through family documents after her grandmother's death and had found a letter, sealed in an envelope with instructions that it not be opened until 25 years after the writer's death. The writer was Sarah Whitmere Gardner, who died in 1998 at the age of 114. Jennifer had opened the letter and, disturbed by its contents, wanted to make it part of the historical record. The Historical Society agreed. The letter is brief, written in Sarah's careful hand, dated January 1997. It reads, "To whoever finds this, I left the settlement in 1901 believing I had escaped. I made a life away from them, had children and grandchildren who know nothing of where I came from, but the agreement doesn't forget. On my 50th birthday, I felt the change beginning, the hollowing. I've fought it for 64 years, maintained my own will through sheer stubbornness, but it's winning. By the time this letter is read, I'll be gone and I'll have rejoined them wherever they went. The counting continues. The cycles continue. They don't need the settlement anymore. They don't need the land. The agreement has grown beyond geography. If you're reading this, if you've studied the Whitmeres, if you've tried to understand what we were, stop. Some knowledge costs more than it's worth. The debt comes due in ways you won't recognize until it's too late. Let us fade from memory. Let the story die. It's the only kindness you can do for those who come after." The letter ends there. Jennifer Gardner reported that her grandmother had been lucid until the end, that she'd never mentioned the Whitmeres, that the family had no knowledge of Sarah's early life beyond vague references to Kansas. Sarah's death certificate lists natural causes. Her burial was conventional. Nothing unusual marked her passing, except that Jennifer, going through her grandmother's effects, found one other item. A small wooden box, old and worn, filled with pieces of carved stone. Each stone bore a symbol. Each symbol matched those documented in Reverend Moss's journal, in Robert Chase's report, in the anthropological surveys of the Whitmere land. There were exactly 50 stones. Jennifer counted them 3 times to be sure. When she contacted the Historical Society, she asked if they wanted the stones as well. The curator she spoke with advised her to dispose of them, suggested breaking them and scattering the pieces, suggested that some artifacts carry weight beyond their physical form. Jennifer agreed. She took the stones to a river, broke them with a hammer, and let the current carry the fragments away. She reported feeling relieved afterward, though she couldn't explain why. She also reported that for 3 nights following, she dreamed of standing in an underground chamber, surrounded by counting marks that stretched into darkness, while something just beyond her vision kept patient track of time in units no human calendar could measure. And so the Whitmere story ends where it began, with questions that circle back on themselves, with evidence that proves nothing except that something occurred, something was maintained, something was fed. The settlement is gone. The people are gone, but the land remembers. And sometimes, on nights when the wind moves wrong across the Kansas prairie, when the silence becomes too profound and the darkness too complete, you might sense what the Whitmeres sensed, what they honored and feared and sustained through decades of isolation. You might feel the attention of something vast and patient, something that's been counting since before names had meaning, something that will continue counting long after the last human voice falls silent. The Whitmeres made their agreement. They kept their terms. And when the debt was paid, they went to whatever place such bargains lead. Whether that's oblivion or transformation or something else entirely, no one can say. But the counting continues. The cycles continue. And somewhere in the darkness beneath the world we know, in spaces where human consciousness rarely ventures, the thing they fed remains, patient and eternal, waiting for the next agreement, the next offering, the next generation foolish or desperate enough to acknowledge what should remain forever unacknowledged.